Hello, Dickinsonians. This is our first professional development webinar for the year of 2020, and we're really pleased to have a guest with us, Mr. Stephen Skalak, 77 grad and a parent of an 07 grad. Once again, this is Annie Condit, the Associate Dean for the Center for Advising Internships and Lifelong Career Development. And we're really excited that we're moving in a different direction with our professional development webinars and really trying to bring experts in the field in to give you some information on how you can do professional elements of your job better or move up in your career. And so I'm going to turn the mic over to Steve here in a second, but I want to tell you a little bit about him before I get started. So Steve was a double major in history and economics, and really more importantly, Dickinson is where he met his wife in '77, in class of '77. After essentially serving an extended internship in the professional development program office, then the Big Eight accounting of Cooper and Lybrand, now half of today's international accounting, tax, and consulting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC, as better known. Steve attended Columbia University's Graduate School of Business, where he acquired an MBA and sufficient credits to meet the educational requirement for CPA in the New York State. Steve was a partner in the New York office of PwC, which now has over 200,000 employees globally. He moved from traditional auditing into transition-based services like acquisitions, valuation, bankruptcy, and investigation, and ultimately served as a forensic accounting team partner and leader for both US and international roles for over 20 years. He and Diane lived in Beijing for 2.5 years, and from 2010 to 2012. Steve has been fortunate to work with clients in many European countries, as well as Canada, Mexico, Brazil, Japan, Korea, China, and India. He now travels for pleasure and continues to enjoy his regular tennis games. So I'm going to go welcome Mr. Skalak for his session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annie. I appreciate it very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my experience with all of you out there in webinar land. We're broadcasting from her office with a beautiful view of the Commons outside the Holland Union building and the library. So just a fantastic location here at Biddle House in the center of Dickinson College. Welcome to this discussion of performance evaluation and management. This is a challenging topic in my view because there are at least two different perspectives that need to be covered, and that of course is that of the evaluator and that of the evaluatee. I've kind of assumed for purposes of this discussion that each of you on the line is likely, as I was for my 40-year career with Coopers and Lybrand and its current version, PricewaterhouseCoopers, a recipient of evaluations as well as a giver of evaluations. And through that experience, I've accumulated several fairly strongly held points of view about the process and what makes it work and what doesn't. And I've also had the chance to observe that with the passage of time, work methods have changed during our lifetime. We've had a lot of change in managerial structures. We have more team orientation, less hierarchy, many types of technological improvements. We now have the virtual office in response to technology tools as well as real estate costs. So substantial elements of business life have been reconfigured during our tenure in the field, or during my tenure in business, which 1975 was my first employment. I was just a sophomore here at Dickinson when I started. And the performance management and evaluation model and the expectations around it are no exception to this change. It's really morphed into a new dynamic where it's essentially a shared responsibility, in my view, between the governed and the governors, or between the boss and the staff, or the boss and the team, the coach and the team. And I'll try and give some examples of that from my own experience. In fact, This entire discussion is based on my experience. I am not a human resources professional. I'm not going to approach this topic from the standpoint of an HR leader or the HR community. I don't think I'm in substantial disagreement with HR professionals about this topic, but my approach is that of the team leader, a business leader, someone who has probably at various times in my career had perhaps the same negative reaction to headquarter types telling me what to do or how to lead my teams when they are not directly involved in the work or not professionally trained in the subject matter or versed in the substance of the work, the service, the product, the business, etc. So I'm proud to be able to say that for my 30 years as a team leader, when I ask my teams to follow me into difficult assignments, strange locations, awkward situations, they always did. And it's from that experience that I'm going to share and talk about performance management. Also on the agenda is a few comments about moving overseas. I thought this was important for a couple of reasons. One, business, of course, is more international than it's ever been, so there's a lot of opportunities out there. Second, international experience, of course, remains at the core of Dickinson's academic approach, and many of you probably have experience in or an interest in international affairs. So I want to share a couple of comments about that at the end. I worked in a large organization with a lot of, big teams and sub-teams and teams within teams and so forth. So I've seen performance evaluation process from the level where we evaluated the national partner complement of 1/3 of PricewaterhouseCoopers, the advisory partners, a unit of about 800 partners, down to much smaller subunits where we're evaluating partner teams of 10 or 15 and the related staff complement of 50 or 100 or 250 professional staff. I've had responsibility for evaluating and managing administrative staff as well, people who are administrative assistants, technology providers, secretaries, and so forth. So I've tried to scroll through my experience and put together, learning points from my career and experiences in respect of performance management and evaluation. I think the first thing I really want to say is the two perspectives are important and they're different, but I think they have more similarities than people may realize. To be successful in performance management, the performance evaluation process, I think both the evaluator, the manager, as well as the evaluatee, the managee, the staff person, whatever the right moniker might be for the business circumstance you're in, you have to prepare with purpose. And preparing with purpose to me means really being prepared to put your performance management observations, your performance management evaluation in the larger context of how you expect that person to participate in your business. If you're not prepared to do that, you're probably not fully prepared to have a good performance evaluation discussion, because the question of, okay, that's great, you told me how I did on the last project for the last 6 weeks, but how does that fit into the bigger picture? That's always going to come up. And I feel to communicate the level of respect for the people working in your teams that's necessary to extract high performance, you need to be prepared to put things in the larger context. And if you're receiving the evaluation, you need to be appreciative of the fact that there is always this larger context. Yes, you got an evaluation on a project that lasted 3 months, 4 months, 8 months, whatever it is. But of course, that's going to be part of a performance management process, which is going to make decisions like, are you eligible for other jobs? Can you be given more responsible assignments? Should you get a raise? Should you be promoted? Or in the negative, do you need to take a lap and sort of, have a do-over time period because you've demonstrated some skill deficiencies and, you need additional training or maturation in some respect. So you need to be prepared to discuss the larger context, to have a catalog of your accomplishments. You need to control your anxieties. I mean, everybody gets anxious about evaluatory comments. It's understandable. But anxiety is a big inhibitor to being the successful recipient of a performance evaluation. You have to find a way to set your defensiveness aside and listen with an open mind. You have to be prepared to comprehend and understand. Now, that's not the same as agreeing. And a little bit later, I think I have the point that, performance evaluation is not an agreement-seeking process, in my opinion. It's a comprehension-seeking process. You have to deliver your evaluation in a manner that the other person can comprehend it, can act on it, can see what you see in delivering the comments, especially negative or points of improvement feedback. You really need people to be able to see it. But, asking someone to agree with your evaluation, especially when it has negative comments, that can be kind of a barrier to comprehension because now the person is thinking about, ooh, should I agree? Should I disagree? Changes the dynamic of the conversation, in my experience, in a negative way. So I would urge avoid seeking agreement, but instead seek comprehension. I would also say that performance evaluation processes have within them the opportunity to encourage your team members by communicating respect for their efforts. And they have also hidden within them real pitfalls of unintentionally communicating lack of respect, lack of attention, or lack of caring or empathy for what your team members have been doing. And the biggest pitfall I've seen is the evaluation where you tell someone everything's fine. You don't have any specific positive points about their work. You don't have any specific negative points about their work. Your feedback is, oh, you're doing great. Don't worry, you're fine. But to me, and in my experience, that is almost like telling the person you don't care because you haven't thought about them and you haven't really given careful thought to what they've done and how their work and their role fits into the organization overall. So I would really urge giving both positive and negative feedback in each evaluation session or meeting. Nobody likes negative feedback, that's true, but it will over time show that you care and will show that you're thinking about their future and their development. Just a brief comment about what's behind this point of view. PricewaterhouseCoopers is a professional services firm in 3 major areas: accounting and auditing, consulting advisory services, and transaction-based services, and tax services. And, most of the people who join PricewaterhouseCoopers, and by most, I mean more than 90%, probably more than 95%, they ultimately leave the firm. It's sort of like a college or university. People come to it, they learn stuff, and then they leave. in the business context, I learned that I wanted people leaving my teams, leaving my employment, leaving PricewaterhouseCoopers. I wanted them leaving with the same feeling that hopefully people have about their college or university. That it was a great time in their life. They learned a lot of stuff. They met people with whom they have relationships that they're going to value throughout their life. And it was a significant impact on their career. That's how I want people to feel about their employment. Now, sometimes that's against my interest because people I'd rather have stay with the firm leave because they learn stuff and they have a lot of opportunity. But I really think over the long term, you have to treat that as a positive, not as a negative in your attitude. So my attitude towards delivering positive and negative feedback, helping people develop, and that's the best long-term course, stems from this underlying view of the nature of our business. Expectations and expectation setting. This, in my view, is just a critical or essential ingredient to the entire question of performance management and performance evaluation. I'm sure we've all had the somewhat disagreeable experience of delivering an evaluation and telling someone, well, you didn't do this, you didn't do that during the time period or during the project, whatever it is, and have the comeback be, well, I didn't even know I was supposed to do that. And of course, that now just sort of defeats, a lot of the benefit that comes from having a good performance evaluation and performance measurement process. So expectations are essential. And the comprehension of expectations, the communication of the expectation, the adjustment of expectations as you go through whatever time period is covered by your cycle are all very essential. In my mind, this is the one thing that can really cause the whole effort to fail if you haven't told people what you expect. It's also been my experience over time, this process of goal setting and expectation has become more and more two-sided. I mean, I think it's fair to say when I started my career in the 80s, expectations were contained in a job description. It was probably handed out on memo paper because we didn't have email. And, it was very top down. You were sort of told what to do. Here's your expectation set, please learn it, please do it. Don't ask any questions, just get it done. And, those days are long gone. I really don't see that that's an effective path to developing a high performing team. You need to have your team members participating in setting the goals, establishing the expectations, thinking through what their job performance is going to contribute to the business mission of the team. It provides an opportunity for the conversation around what the expectations are, why they are what they are, why they're important, why they're developmental. And it also, of course, clarifies them so you can avoid the surprise of saying, what do you mean you didn't know this was an expectation? I also think it's important that, expectations should be in a range. There should be some easy expectations or goals. There should be some stretch or difficult expectations or goals. There should be a portfolio. Some should be quantitative. Some should be more subjective. So I really think the portfolio approach, especially in the professional services environment, is the best approach to expectation setting. And presumably when you get to the end of the period and you're looking back and you're doing the evaluation, some will be met and some will not. But again, it provides a basis for a developmental conversation that, even though it contains some criticisms, here were some expectations that were unmet, presumably within the portfolio, you have others that were. So creating the ability with the expectations set to have a balanced conversation when you do get to the retrospective element of the process, I think is very important. It just sets up a much more productive communication. The other thing that I think is very important about the essential ingredient element of expectations is that it's necessarily the case that some expectations are more important than others. And that's going to depend on what your business mission is, what your role is in the business. But, you know, all business organizations, virtually all entities are ultimately subject to some degree of financial measurement. And I think it's disingenuous to try and escape this fundamental fact of business life by not factoring it into the expectations set. So, you know, communicating where in the hierarchy, and in my experience, it's normally fairly high in the hierarchy of expectations, meeting budget, meeting a monetary goal of some sort, whether it's sales or revenue measure or something like that, where that expectation ranks in the priority scale, I think is an important thing to have an honest conversation about. And in the professional world, where there's a lot of different pressures on the senior people to do a lot of different activities, you know, the one constant is that you know, the business has to be financially successful, or all of the other good efforts are for naught. So it necessarily takes a prominent place in the expectation process. I just never found any benefit to hiding from that in any way. I think, you know, you really have to be just very upfront and matter of fact about which expectations are the core of the expectation set. I made a little chart of the performance evaluation cycle. I suspect it's not that different from a lot of, it's generic enough, I guess, to be not that different from virtually any corporate, business, academic evaluation cycle. And I really just want to use the chart, you know, to make a few background comments about things that I see as pitfalls. And the first pitfall I want to talk about is the frequency, what I think of as the frequency failure. And that is the natural tendency to sort of avoid the conversation around whether expectations were met or not met on a regular, periodic basis. There's something about human nature and human interaction that, you know, having a evaluatory or comparative conversation is always a little bit uncomfortable. I think a lot of us, you know, we block ourselves. You might want to tell somebody they, you know that last piece of the project you worked on, you know, that really was an awkward way to go about it. You know, maybe you should have considered X and Y. But you just don't want to do it because they're already assigned another piece of the project and it's critical, and you want them focused, and you don't want them distracted or upset because you're giving them some negative or critical or developmental comments, you know, while this other part of the project is going on. So you delay, you don't share. And I just think this is a common pitfall. It's better to get it out there right away, you know, have the quick discussion. So avoid the frequency failure, you know, have frequent conversations about where people stand, how they're doing, even if it's just to affirm performance. That was good, do that again, or, that's the right approach. We'll have to think of ways to replicate that in other parts of our work, or whatever it might be. People like affirmation, and I think giving affirmative comments is a good way to maintain energy and a high-performing team in whatever it is you might be doing. Negative feedback has to be given immediately as well. The corrosive impact of dealing with a subpar performer generally far outweighs in the long run the momentary upset over having to have the difficult conversation with someone about subpar performance. So again, needs to be done right when it happens. You just cannot let a subpar performance fester over a long period of time because you're perhaps reluctant to go through the work effort to have the difficult conversations that surround subpar performance. I know there's a natural inclination to put it off, wait for the right time, and all these sorts of things. But my experience looking back has always been the right time is right when it happens and before it has a corrosive effect on the rest of the team. So I would strongly encourage that. So I think I've hit some of the points on this slide. Constant conversation, I guess, is the flip side of the frequency failure point. I worked in an environment where there was a substantial age difference sometimes between, the two elements of the performance evaluation cycle or process. And over time, I came to understand that separation in age seems to multiply the impact of a negative comment. And, by the time I was, let's say 55 and, criticized something a 25-year-old did, the weight that I intended on the comment generally was heard by the younger person at 3 or 4 or 5 times the weight or significance that I intended it to be. And, I don't know whether this is true in all businesses or all circumstances. Certainly all people are different, probably hard to have a rule of thumb. But I came to appreciate the fact that, age difference does have an impact. And I came to think of it as sort of the negativity multiplier, and I changed the way I would deliver negative feedback. Another thing that I think is a difficult circumstance to deal with in performance evaluation cycle is the question of long-serving employees who are in the same or similar role for many years. And I just want to make the observation that loyalty and experience should never be confused with performance. Loyalty is not a substitute for performance. Experience is not a substitute for performance. Experience is supposed to be an aid to performance. It's supposed to make your performance superior because you are experienced. Your experience isn't doing that. It's a difficult thing. But I think in large organizations in particular, you get the psychology, maybe the bureaucratic psychology of, oh, the person's been with us forever. What would we do without them? So on and so forth. But you really need to find a way to introduce objectivity into the role maybe that's best done through making sure job descriptions and expectations are changing over time and that change is being well and thoroughly communicated. But I've seen this factor of loyalty and experience being accepted as a substitute for adequate job performance create some pretty significant problems. And it usually leads to a big blow up in the end. Finally, everybody's all upset, somebody gets fired, and creates an ugly situation that doesn't really help anyone in the end. So I would say better to identify the possibility and avoid it than anything else. The other thing I would say is that I've learned over time is, being respectful of other people, even if you're being critical of their job and are sort of negative on their prospects with your organization. It doesn't cost anything to be respectful of the other person and deliver whatever your negative comments are in a manner that allows them to retain their identity, retain their dignity, and so forth. What I've labeled face, the concept of saving face. That's generally free to a manager, generally free to an organization. It just doesn't cost anything to show respect. And, getting yourself in a lather over somebody's failures or that sort of thing and ending up, hopefully inadvertently, but, making some denigrating comments about the person, it's just not helpful. Certainly we've all had situations where we've gotten angry or annoyed and have said stuff that we regret. But in preparing for the performance evaluation discussion, I really urge avoiding that type of thing. And finally, I've already said it's not an agreement-seeking activity. It's not a negotiation. I mean, you need to be sufficiently confident in the evaluation you're delivering that you can deliver it and seek the other person's comprehension of it, acknowledgement of it, but they don't have to agree with it. I mean, I think that's an important point. Some trends and challenges, over my 35 years, I've seen the performance evaluation process go from one with relatively little input by the evaluatee, the person being evaluated, to a situation where they're expected to do quite a lot of work to have input to the process. And anybody who's in that situation, I would encourage you to, take the time to do it. Self-evaluation, self-reflection, challenging yourself, those can be uncomfortable activities. You may not enjoy that. Sort of hard to think about yourself and set things down, but you need to do it. And you're being given a great opportunity by your employer to have input and control and some level of authority over the process. I would say take it. Shame on you if you don't. I mean, this is an important aspect. It probably varies in frequency depending on what your role is. Partners at PwC, for example, basically have 2 conversations a year about their performance. But, it's important to be prepared. People who put it off, I'm too busy, I can't be bothered, and that type of approach. In the end, they were less thoughtful about how they could contribute to the success of the firm than people who set aside the 5 hours or whatever was needed to think through what they were doing. The other challenge I've seen sort of time and time again in managing professionals or knowledge workers, as it were, is what I think of as the boredom challenge. I mean, smart, high-performing people like Dickinson College graduates, for example, I mean, these are people with superior intellects and interests, and, you know, there are many aspects of professional services projects that can be repetitive and boring. So, you know, you have the challenge of maintaining attention and a high level of performance, you know, despite the fact there can be aspects of the work that are dull. And, you know, keeping the end in sight, having a goal, rotating staff, rotating jobs. I mean, these are all things that can be done as a manager to try and overcome the boredom challenge. But I would say as a general matter, you know, the worst or most insidious performance difficulties I've had to deal with in my career are the difficulty that comes from the competent person who's just not interested in doing the work. And, you know, if they're not interested, I usually end up telling them, go work somewhere else where you are interested in the work. But I think the boredom challenge can be a significant challenge to the managerial skill in the knowledge space. So I'm going to say a few things about international assignments. Really, I'm going to make my one main point about that, and then maybe we can have some questions and redirect this conversation to topics that you all listening are interested in, as opposed to what I'm carrying on about. I had the good fortune to go on an international assignment. I went to the Beijing office at PwC. It was, that was a great 2.5 years. I'm really glad I did it. And it was easy to say, put my hand up and say, listen, I'm volunteering to go to Beijing and, you know, help the team there, try and grow our business and expand it and so forth. You know, my colleagues were thrilled, you know, great. But, you know, the return trip, coming back to where you were or the office you were in, you know, is not necessarily as easy. And I would say that people undertaking international assignments generally are spending a lot of time, you know, mapping out the departure leg. You know, where are you going? What's it going to be like? What's the culture like? Where are you going to live? You know, what's the language pressure going to be? And so forth. And you forget to think about mapping it all the way through to what type of return path are you going to have. So I would say thinking through, you know, the whole cycle of the international assignment and its importance is probably critical, and a lot of that may fall on you, because it's not always the case that the nature of international missions are sort of well understood within the organization of the whole. And I think it's important to understand, you know, is your mission to go overseas, is that the pet project of a particular business leader, or is that a core objective of the organization as a whole? Traditional metrics might not apply when you're on international assignment. For example, if you're in a client service industry, maybe none of the clients' decision-making officers are located in the overseas location, but it's a location where they need support and, you know, need services. So, okay, well, maybe that's good to be in that role where you're providing the services, but maybe you're losing the opportunity to develop skills as a manager of relationships, manager of revenue, because, you know, it's more of a service delivery role. So in the end, there's a lot of trust, it seems to me, between you and the organization that is involved in taking an international opportunity, and especially in managing the return from an international opportunity. hopefully you don't have to deal with any closed mindsets, but I think you should be aware. Everyone should, have that skeptical view of their own organization. The bureaucracy or the headquarters staff, always seems to have a mindset that they're special, and people who are outside of it can't possibly understand the pressures and importance of what they're doing, and that can make returning difficult. Increases your responsibility to communicate what you're doing and why it's important. So international assignments are great, and I would encourage people to seek that experience, but I would also say, they need to be approached thoughtfully and with an appropriate amount of skepticism about the return path and an appropriate amount of planning around what the return path or the developmental nature of the path really is. And then I think you can enjoy international experiences to a much greater degree than if all of these things are in doubt. So let me stop talking, and I think Annie is going to find a way to turn on the camera so you can see this talking head that's been carrying on about performance evaluation for the last 35 or so minutes, and hopefully we have some questions. I welcome your questions. I'll do my best to share my experience if it's relevant to the question, and give you the best answer I can.
Okay, so I'm going to be over here moderating the questions and doing my best to sum up what you're asking. So first thing someone asked, it said it was a very helpful presentation and wanted to know if the PowerPoint will be provided. For those that are out there, if you registered for this presentation, you will have access to the content for at least the next 2 years. So do know that you can access the content anytime. So the next question is, any merit to providing evaluees with an overall performance rating? Example, 1 through 5. Does this act as a demotivator since most will be in the middle of the bell curve, i.e. 3?
Right. So first let me confess my own bias. I worked in an environment at PricewaterhouseCoopers where people are ranked in categories. I believe we used 4 categories. My own experience is that you should use an even number of rating categories, either 4 or 6, and not 3 or 5, because this forces you to put everybody either above or below the middle. And while that can be uncomfortable, it does tend to sharpen one's thinking about the topic and about the person being evaluated and about what your hopes and plans for their career path are. Now, on the question of whether it's demotivating, my comment would be this is a bit of a complicated question. I think for teams of people that are relatively fresh from the academic environment, the answer is yes, it can be a little demotivating or deflating to be, shall we say, average or met expectations as opposed to excellent. And I think this is an important transition or maturation process from the academic environment where you get frequent evaluations and exams, and you're not necessarily in an environment where you're being compared to a peer group and separated based on perceived differences between you and another person. You're being judged or graded according to a standard or rubric related to the material. And if you master all the material, you get the high grade. And if you don't, you don't. In a business environment, you're likely getting evaluated in comparison to peers. And While it's demotivating, it's a important fact of life, and people need to learn it and need to get used to it. So I would not necessarily discourage the use of the numeric scale, but I would encourage the use of adequate conversation around its use and why it's being used, so that you can minimize the demotivating or deflating aspect of it. But I think your observation that it inherently contains this risk is correct, but I'm just not sure that's a reason not to use it.
So a follow-up question that we received about where to access the content. In a link, I will be sending you a survey at the end of the day. That link will give you access to all the content if you were looking for that. So the next question is, what do you believe is the optimal way to deal with employees who, during their evaluation, insist on comparing and contrasting their performance with that of other members of the team?
Always an awkward circumstance, to be sure. First of all, I would say that while difficult to do, it's important to point out that that's not their responsibility. So if they are providing information about their performance and what they perceive it to be relative to another person, I would say, something along the lines of, well, thank you for the comparative analysis. Of course, I'll think about that. But my evaluation of your performance is based on your performance relative to the expectations that we both know were established for your role in the organization, for this project, for this time period, for this job grade, whatever it might be. And I think you need to take a somewhat firm approach along the lines of, thank you for sharing your point of view. I will, of course, reflect on it and consider it, but please understand that, the evaluation points we're discussing today are about your performance and what you can do to contribute to the organization in a better way. And I think that's kind of what I've done in my experience when that has come up. But I agree with you. This is a pretty awkward circumstance. I guess part of how well you can and how strongly you can deal with this goes to how confident you are that your compensation system, is fairly treating and distinguishing, between your people. And if you're confident in that, I think you can be pretty strong on this point that, the performance evaluation conversation is not meant to be your analysis of your comparative performance, but is meant to be a discussion of my evaluation as your manager of your performance, and you should be trying to comprehend what that means and what you can do to improve your performance and get the conversation back to that two-way conversation as opposed to some across the board analysis of how I see myself relative to my peers. I hope that's helpful.
So at PwC, is non-retention of personnel after return from an international assignment thought of as a problem?
Not that I know of, but there are some aspects of going on an international assignment that are a little disconcerting. I mean, I have been a partner since 1990. I went to Beijing in 2009, and I forget what agreement it was I had to sign or whatever, but sort of the last point above the signature block was something like the international assignee recognizes that the same job or the same job location may not be available to them upon their return, right? So it's this reservation to the firm of flexibility in making partner assignments and determining partner roles. And I will say that took me aback a little bit. I sort of sat there and looked at that and said, what exactly does this mean? And, that's why I said, there has to be a certain degree of trust between you and the organization. Now, in fact, I went to China and I basically came back to my job in New York, and there was no problem or no issue. But, the way it's set up sort of gives you a little bit of pause and makes you think about it. I haven't heard any horror stories from colleagues at PwC about going somewhere internationally and then coming back, but it's such a big organization. I'm sure there must be someplace. But fortunately, in my little part of the firm, of about 2,500 professionals globally was my little part of the firm. Probably 500 of whom were in the United States and the other 2,000 in various countries around the world. I didn't really encounter that problem. So anyway, I can't really give a complete answer for the whole firm, but I don't think it's thought of as a problem.
Someone mentioned about portfolio approach versus developmental approach in evaluation, and can you explain that?
I can explain what I meant when I said there should be a portfolio aspect to, goal setting. You shouldn't set monolithic type goals and just say have a sales target be the only goal for the year and not have any other goals for the person to have achieved. I mean, that's what I meant by portfolio approach, have a variety of goals, some of which are quantitative, some of which are subjective, some of which are technical skills, some of which are soft skills, so there's a portfolio of things being measured during the year. I don't think that's inconsistent with a developmental approach where you want the person to develop across a series of skills or skill sets. You want people to develop managerial skills, interpersonal skills, client relation skills. You want them to develop new technical knowledge, knowledge of new standards, knowledge of new technologies, knowledge of new ways to employ technologies in business processes. I mean, there's a lot of different things you might want a person to develop during the year. So if you're talking about what I said, have a portfolio of goals, I don't see having a portfolio of expectations as being at all inconsistent with the developmental approach. I meant just don't be overly focused on just one thing.
So should we consider the fact that an employee has no ambition for advancement as a negative?
That depends on your business, and it depends on the role that that person is in within the organization. So I would say that's entirely a contextual evaluation. My own experience is professional services, and the professional services model and context is one of continual development and skill deployment. So that's generally not an appropriate attitude in that context. I'm sure there's exceptions, but generally not an acceptable attitude. I'm sure there's many environments where it's fine, where you need people who know what to do, exactly how to do it consistently, show up every day, get it done, can go faster if needed, can teach others how to do it, but don't want to do anything else. I'm sure there's team roles and environments where that's not only satisfactory, where it's highly desirable. But it hasn't been my experience that it fits very well in the professional services environment, but that's not to say there aren't many business environments where it's very useful to have people like that.
What is the most difficult thing you've had to deal with coming back to the US?
So the most difficult thing I had to deal with in coming back to the US is that I was a team member instead of a team leader. Because obviously when I went to China, all my team leadership roles were transitioned to other partners staying in the US. So, I kind of left as one of a group of partners who, was leading our business. And, I came back to be one of the partners who was participating in our business. So, that was a bit different. But I knew that was going to happen, when I started down the path of organizing to go to China. And I knew that the roles that I had needed to transition to other partners anyway, because we have to have generational change, we have to have leadership change, other people have to get the experience and so forth. So, it was a satisfying way to make that transition for me. But, sure, when I came back, it was different, and I had to adjust my mindset a little bit. I could no longer go to the partner meeting and announce what we were going to do. I now had to go to the partner meeting and suggest and perhaps persuade that, this would be a way to think about things or a way to do things. So, it made my role a little different, and I had to get used to it. But I would say that was the biggest thing.
So someone here says that they work in a seasonal industry where they are on and offboarding people, line level employees, every 6 months. Have you ever worked in the seasonal workforce? And if so, how does that change your approach?
Yeah, I have not worked in a seasonal workforce, so I'm afraid I'm not going to have anything too sensible to say about the on and offboarding process. The closest I've come to that is bringing people on for a particular project, and when the project is over, their employment is over. I don't know how similar that is to your seasonal example. I will say it put a lot of pressure on our onboarding process, because we discovered that not only did we have to teach people what the job requirements were, but we had to teach people what the expectations were for working within the culture of our firm and the culture of our teams. And, we had some negative experiences where we'd bring a person in for a project and, they'd have a set of attitudes around, let's say, being out of town and drinking too late in the evening that maybe was out of step with, their colleagues. So we have to think about in the onboarding process, how are we going to talk about teaming environment, personal habits, relations on the road, and that sort of thing, in order to make sure that people who haven't grown up in the firm are on board with the firm's attitudes and approach to these types of things. So we did have a lot of pressure on the onboarding process when we were bringing people on for a project circumstance. But again, I don't know how relevant that is to the seasonal part business. And we had a clear expectation, project's over, you're gone. I mean, not to be, blunt or negative about it, but, that was a very clear expectation. So, people knew that their employment was temporary.
Okay, and the last question we have is, what would you do with an employee who's in an evaluation becomes defensive and emotional?
Well, I think the first comment I have about that is I have had that, and I've had that, generally with, people who were experiencing performance difficulties. But I think the first thing to do is, recognize that it's an appropriate way to feel, and that you're not put off by it, and you can understand that they have anxieties and that they're being defensive about it and they're emotional about it. Now, emotional, can take a lot of different forms. Apologize for the background beeping here. But, you know, I've delivered evaluations to my partners where, you know, they've ended up screaming at me, right? So the emotional outburst was, you know, one of outrage and disagreement. You know, I've had people cry in my office because, you know, they were upset or concerned about, you know, what the evaluation meant for their prospects, that sort of thing. So, but, you know, through it all, I think the basic messages are, number one, you have to maintain your temperament. And if the other person's emotional, you have to, you know, be careful yourself not to overreact. Secondly, I think it's important not to reject the person's feelings, you know, not to tell them, well, don't feel like that or shouldn't feel like that. They obviously do feel like that, you know, so you need to have a conversation around, you're feeling this, you know, why are you feeling this? You know, talk to me about it, you know, type thing. So I think you have to help people work through it. And if that sort of, you know, kills the intended purpose of the meeting, or, you know, creates the need to have another discussion, well, then I think you have to do that. But I think you have to maintain a respectful discussion and be careful not to reject the way the other person is feeling, because I think that's always the temptation, is to say, well, you shouldn't feel like that. Don't feel like that. But they do, so you need to have the conversation about why they feel like that.
All right, well, those are all the questions we have. I want to say thank you to Steve for sharing your wisdom with us and your years of experience. And I appreciate all of you that tuned in to our first professional development webinar of the new year. So I hope to see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you all.